welcome back to the podcast. And I think it's actually, we had a look and it's been a couple of years since we last recorded.
Yeah, thank you for having me back. Yes, I think it was January 2024, I think it was, yes.
Exactly then. Right. So we're 2 years on, and in between you have authored a book about managing autoimmune diseases through diet. So just can you recap and start by telling us about your health journey?
Yes, well, in a lot of ways, the key part started in 2015. So I was working in intensive care. So I was a junior sister in ITU. And I'd been poorly. I'd managed to catch a flu virus off a patient, which is one of the risks that you have working in that environment. And then 2 months later, I started getting this really bad pain in my right eye. And I just ignored it because, that's what we do. But after a couple of weeks, eyesight started going blurry. And within a few days, the sight had disappeared completely. And I did actually go to the eye hospital and to get it investigated, and saw a neurologist, an ophthalmic neurologist, and they said I had optic neuritis, which is an inflammation of the optic nerve. And I had previously worked in neuro ITU, and so I kind of come across it, but not really a lot. So I just thought, oh, everything's fine. Gradually, the sight started to return, which was obviously really good. And just as I was about to go back to work, the sight of my other eye started playing up. Fortunately, not as bad. And then some strange things started happening, and I started losing sensation in my left arm and being a bit wobbly, and eventually agreed to have various tests, which I'd resisted, like a lumbar puncture and lots of MRI scans. And then in March 2016, went to see a different neurologist, and she said I had multiple sclerosis, which was quite a shock, to be honest, because I'd been in a lot of denial, and I didn't really think there was too much of a problem. But it was really devastating because I'd looked after patients with this condition, and I thought I knew what my future was going to hold. It was a really difficult time. Fortunately, I had a colleague whose husband had MS, and she told me about the diet and lifestyle program that is Overcoming MS. So I looked at that. Now, I was already plant-based by this point, and I was already teaching people about eating a plant-based diet, because I'd set up my alter ego, the sensitive foodie. And the Overcoming MS plan is a whole food plant-based diet with fish and seafood if you want to. I never went down that route, but also other lifestyle things like stress management and exercise, vitamin D, all of those things. So I was lucky. I got very quickly on board with making some changes. But I did also go down the disease modifying therapy route, because why not? I was just wanted to do whatever I could in order to be as well as I could be. I didn't want this MS to put me in a wheelchair, essentially, because that's the vision that I had. But unluckily for me, the DMTs had some really bad side effects for me. The first one I took made me feel really unwell, and then my liver started affecting my liver. So then I had to stop that. And then I tried one of the injectables, and my body came out with these enormous wheals where the injections had got in. So again, that just wasn't going to work. And then within that time, I also got diagnosed with a couple of other things as well, including malignant melanoma, which possibly came from related to the first disease modifying therapy because it affects your immune system. So the first few years were really bumpy, to say the least. But I realized that the one way I could have as much control as I could was through the food that I ate. So I was very strict with what I ate, really having a whole food plant-based diet. And I was exercising, which often is just physical activity. So for me, getting outside is really key, not just to get the vitamin D, but just to be out in nature. And, that helps with stress management as well and dealing with things. Giving up nursing, that was stressful in itself, but actually was really good for me as well. So that's kind of the journey and where I am now. So I'm coming up to 10 years since diagnosis. And in that time, I've had one small new lesion. So multiple sclerosis is these lesions that you get in your brain or your spinal cord or in your optic nerve. I've just had one small lesion, but nothing in the last 5 years. And I'm just, doing my best I can with the lifestyle and living as well as possible. And to mark my 10-year anniversary, I decided to do a half marathon. So I'm training to a very slow one, but to me, it's just doing whatever I can to live as well as I can. And even though, things flare up, if I get too hot, if I get too cold, if I get too stressed, if I do too much, the MS sort of shows itself, whether or not my eyesight goes a bit blurry or fatigue. But that's also under my control as well. So that's it, really, I think.
There's so much in what you've said already. Obviously, you've alluded to some of the things that can be triggers for autoimmune disease. So that stressful time working in ITU, and certainly the experience you had with side effects from the traditional medications used to try and manage autoimmune disease would be enough to turn anybody, any sensible person, towards things like lifestyle measures that aren't going to have side effects as a way of helping you to manage an autoimmune disease better. But can we take a step back and just look at that term autoimmune disease? Because I think even as healthcare professionals, we often take this term for granted. And I've certainly caught myself saying to a patient, oh, I don't think, your arthritis is anything like rheumatoid arthritis. And then the patient will say to me, what's rheumatoid arthritis? And I'll say, oh, it's an autoimmune disease. And then they sometimes come back and say, oh, what's an autoimmune disease? And you find yourself thinking, oh, I'm not sure I can explain this easily. So can you explain to us what we mean when we say autoimmune disease, and maybe a bit more about what these diseases do in the body?
Yeah, sure. Essentially, we have our bodies, we have our immune system, it's our internal defense system, and it picks up on, I was going to say antigens, but that's a word I'll come back to in a minute, but it picks up on compounds that appear that might be dangerous if we get a virus. So it's something we start getting really snotty, we feel unwell. That's all signs of our immune system fighting that virus off. And that's what we want it to do. And we have our innate immune system, which we're born with, and then we have our adaptive immune system, which responds to insults, if you like, so to infections or pathogens, and it learns to recognize what is good for us and what is not so good for us. What happens with autoimmune disease is that the immune system, for some reason, becomes really confused and overwhelmed. And instead of responding to a danger, it starts to recognize our own healthy tissue as the danger, and it starts to attack that instead. And often this is through a process called molecular mimicry. So, for example, with me, with the optic neuritis, what was happening was that something, possibly my immune system, identified something in the proteins in the myelin sheath, which is a protective covering around the nerves. And it decided, for me, in my eye, that needed to be broken down and removed. So it started attacking that myelin sheath or the proteins in the myelin sheath. And the thing is, this can happen at any point in the body. So there's lots of different types of autoimmune diseases. There's over 100, and they can either be organ specific. So, for example, type 1 diabetes, which attacks the cells in your pancreas that produce insulin, or they can be systemic, like rheumatoid arthritis, as you've mentioned, which it attacks the connective tissue around the joints and around the body. And so it just depends on how your body responds as to what part of the body it decides to attack. And this can be a sustained attack, or it can flare up and calm down again. And once you've got an autoimmune disease, it's there for life. Anytime that your immune system gets overstimulated, you generally have a flare up of some type, and that stimulation could be what you get a cold, or a lot of autoimmune conditions get worse because of a urine infection, for example. Then your body goes into overdrive again. Or it could be something that you're eating. And if you've got this continual low-grade inflammation, which is the driver for a lot of chronic health conditions, then that just keeps everything burning, and your immune system just consistently overstimulated. So it would just carry on attacking the areas of your body that it's decided it doesn't want anymore.
Right. So there are all these potential triggers, aren't there, for autoimmune disease that you've
Mm.
mentioned. And then you alluded there to, the idea that there might be a food triggering things at certain points, because if you've got that background disease, lots of things could lower the threshold for your symptoms manifesting it themselves. And we were wondering, with all of the lifestyle advice that's out there, what was it, do you think, that meant that you in particular were drawn to exploring nutrition as a tool for managing your own disease?
I think the food side of things for me was really interesting because I was already a nutritionist. I had some food intolerances. So this is before the MS. This is where my journey was going. I knew I had a problem with dairy. It was giving me really bad headaches. Something I'd had my whole life. I just hadn't made the connection. And indeed, that may well have been something that was fueling this eventual movement over into MS, because when my eye first started hurting, it was a really familiar pain. So this had been coming and going for a long time, but it just hadn't been quite as dramatic. So I'd already made these changes. But the thing is, food is something that we have opportunities for most people 3 times a day, So it's just something that we can really have a really positive influence and really feel like that we are doing our best to be well. And our bodies are literally made from the food that we eat. Our cells are constantly turning over, obviously some faster than others, but eventually our body can only use the compounds that we give it through the food that we eat. So if we're eating food that is just a bit rubbish, basically, then that's what our bodies become. They when we're eating a lot of saturated fats, when we're fueling it with compounds that trigger the inflammation, that release lots of these free radical compounds, and we're not providing it with the compounds that can help calm that down, like the healthy fats or antioxidants that you find in lots of fresh fruits and vegetables and things like that. So for me, it was a no-brainer really, but I guess partly because I was already on that journey. So I already had the proof that I knew that I could feel better with food. And I think as a yo-yo dieter, but since moving to a plant-based diet, I'd lost the weight and I never put it back on again. And I felt so much better that I knew that it was a really important way, and it was had a real good efficacy, if you like, so that helped. So, and also it's great. I mean, plant-based food is so tasty and so much fun because you can really experiment with it. For me, it was a much better way of managing the condition, a much more enjoyable way than putting myself through some, like the medication, for example. And that's not saying I'm anti-medication, because obviously I've got, the sensible head on. And if it works for you, and a lot of people do really well with the autoimmune medications, and if there was one that I could take, then I would, but there isn't. But the medication and the food and the lifestyle changes, that's what makes the difference. And some people can come off their medications because a lot of them can have a really awful side effects. And so their condition's under control, but they're not really living well. They just the side effects are just really unpleasant. So if you can get to that point where you can start to come off, then that's great, you know. And in the book, I've written that I've got stories of other people who've used a whole food plant-based diet to manage their conditions, and again, managing to come off their medications, which is great news.
It is, and we certainly share your enthusiasm for the tastiness of plant-based diets and the variety and the abundance of different foods that you can find yourself eating. Another word that often comes up in the context of autoimmune disease and other diseases, of course, is inflammation. And we wondered if we could talk a little bit about what research actually tells us about plant-based diets and reducing inflammation in the body.
There is a lot of research about the benefits of plant-based diets for health, full stop. One of my starting points was actually looking at all of the research about the Mediterranean diet, which is a mainly plant-based way of eating, and looking not just at the longevity, but also the impact that that can have on reducing chronic health conditions like obesity and hypertension. And we know that there's a lot of research out there that shows that plant-based diets or diets that are really rich in fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, whole grains, and pulses does have a beneficial effect on the body. And a lot of this is then connected back to gut health, which, you know, in the research on the microbiome that's been coming out over the last few years is huge. And again, there's elements in the plant-based diet which are really supportive of the microbiome. So we know that the microbiome flourishes on fiber, for example, because that's its food. That is what the microbiome breaks down and thrives on. We also know that the microbiome loves polyphenols, which are a group of colourful compounds that are found in fruits and vegetables, but also in the colours of the skins of some beans and nuts and seeds. And the microbiome and our health overall, and if you like, our inflammatory state, are just so connected. And one of the things that it does is when it's healthy and it's being given lots of food to eat, so lots of fermentable fibres and polyphenols, it produces short chain fatty acids. In the short term, that's their food, but also short chain fatty acids become metabolites and signaling compounds, which also helps to moderate the immune system. So it's not just directly through the compounds in the food that we eat that has this impact within the body, like I say, with the antioxidants, so sort of calming down these free radicals that cause inflammation, but also the signaling within the body that's saying that all is well. And on the other side, fats, saturated fats in particular, are known to fuel inflammation, partly within the gut itself. So saturated fat actually irritates the gut lining, and the gut lining is where all this inflammation starts. You know, 70% of the immune system is in or around the gut. Eating a Western diet, so it's high meat, high fat, high sugar, high salt, low in fiber, all of those things just keeps on triggering this inflammation and not giving the body an opportunity to calm that down.
You talked about the Mediterranean diet and that being an eating pattern that's rich in plants and things like that. But are we starting to know more about, beyond having lots of short chain fatty acids and polyphenols, are there any other specific nutrients that you might find in plant foods in particular that are particularly supportive for autoimmune conditions?
The other main things are omega-3 fatty acids and polyunsaturated fatty acids. So the types of fats that you're going to find in nuts and seeds mainly, they just have a much more calming effect on the body. And omega-3 and omega-6 in a very simplified way get absorbed at the same point within the body, so within the actual gut lining, and they work against each other to a certain amount, so they compete for absorption. What omega-6 does is it helps with switching on our immune response, which is really important, because if we do get, say, a virus, for example, if we don't know to respond to it, then that virus is just going to wipe us out. So that immune system is there to be turned on. And so omega-6 is part of that cascade. Now, it's not the only part of it, but it certainly influences it. Whereas omega-3, that helps to turn that cascade off again. So it's part of that messaging system to say, okay, everything's fine now, we can calm down, you know, put all of those killer cells back to bed, ready for the next time. And the problem with the way that we eat in the Western world now is that it's overwhelmed with omega-6 fatty acids. So whether or not that's in the way in the meat that's being eaten, in the excess amount of dairy that's been eaten, and in a lot of processed and ultra processed foods, and really low in omega-3 fatty acids, which for your standard person eating is going to be found in oily fish, nuts and seeds, and some green leafy vegetables if they get eaten. So a much smaller amount. And so when you're overwhelmed with that, then you're just constantly triggering that inflammation. And again, it's the same process for any chronic health condition that's got this low-grade inflammation. When you're eating for autoimmune disease, you really want to change that ratio. And so first thing is not eating any meat, then you're cutting out a great source of that, as well as other inflammatory compounds as well. So there's a variety of those we can have a look at. But you're increasing your amounts of nuts and seeds. With the program that I follow with Overcoming MS, we actually supplement with cold pressed flaxseed oil, which is an acquired taste, I have to admit. I was really interested to listen to your recent podcast about fats and oils. The person you interviewed mentioned that in MS, cold pressed flaxseed oil seems to have a really positive effect. Not sure why, but it does seem to. In a research program called Holism, which is based from the neuroepidemiology unit in Melbourne, Australia, they're showing a 60% reduction in relapse rates when you supplement with cold pressed flaxseed oil, which is incredible. That's the same amount as you get with some of the disease modifying therapies. And so what it's doing is it's really giving you a really high dose of omega-3 fatty acids. And with the rest of the diet, when you're reducing the amount of omega-6 fatty acids, then you're putting your body much more into this balance that it needs to be in. So yes, so healthy fats is really important as well.
Right. So can we blanket say that all plant foods are good, or are there any foods that some people who've got an autoimmune disease might need to avoid even from the plant kingdom?
Absolutely. So I said that there's over 100 different types of autoimmune disease, and they are all different. But there's a few things that everybody with autoimmune has in common, and one of those is dysbiosis. So it is an imbalance in your microbiome, and obviously often poor gut health, because those two come hand in hand. So you've got this sort of leaky gut, inflammatory gut. And that means that some people really do react to certain types of foods. Now, the most common one that people think about is gluten. So if you've got celiac disease, for example, that is the real problem. So the protein in gluten and a protein in the gut lining is similar. And so the immune system is deciding that the gluten is causing a problem, but then it starts attacking the gut lining. So people with celiac disease, definitely gluten. And there are other conditions like Hashimoto's. There is an association with gluten for that one, but it's not an overall umbrella with regards to the evidence. So for example, MS, there is no clear evidence that that gluten is a problem. It tends to be dairy more, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't go gluten free if it helps you feel better. So like in the book, with all the recipes, I've actually made them, they're all gluten free recipes so that it covers everybody with autoimmune disease. However, if you choose to have whole wheat, then you can also make them with whole wheat, which I like that because there's a little bit of irony, because usually it's, oh, you can adapt it for gluten free. So I've made it the other way round. So that's one particular food. Another food that comes up is foods in the nightshades. So that's things like tomatoes, peppers, potatoes. Now, that's an interesting one because I tried to find the research behind that and I couldn't. But we do know that some people with autoimmune disease do respond negatively towards these. So the only figure I could find was that it's about 10% of people with autoimmune disease have a problem with nightshades. But often people are told just avoid them. But these foods, particularly peppers and tomatoes, for example, we are also packed full with lovely antioxidants and phytonutrients. So if it's not a problem for someone, they could be really missing out. So again, it's kind of like looking at it. How do I feel about this? You know, what effects is it having on me? And often at the beginning, when you start eating differently, everything's so jumbled. It's difficult to be able to highlight what is causing a problem and what isn't. But as things start to improve, you can tell how you feel when you eat certain things. And then the other one that often is a problem, or some people find a problem in the short term, is pulses, so beans and lentils and things like that. Now, that's often because of the dysbiosis, or like this overgrowth of bacteria, what we call bad bacteria. And often it's oligosaccharides, these really complex sugars that are found in them, often called FODMAPs. And people react to those quite uncomfortably. So, you know, you get bloating, you get lots of wind. And really, what's going on there is this fermentable fiber, the bacteria are actually really enjoying it. And so they're creating a lot of gas, because they're really chomping down on this fermentable fibre, and if you're not used to it, or you know, certain types of bacteria can produce like a lot of hydrogen and sulfur and things like that. So it's actually really uncomfortable. So it doesn't mean that it's bad for you. It's just that your gut isn't dealing with it very well. So in the short term, you may need to think about what it is that you're eating, or how much you're eating. But ultimately, it comes down to real individuality, because I believe that everybody respond, you know, has a problem with something, you know, even something that's supposed to be really healthy. For example, my husband, he can't eat beetroot. You know, he loves it, but it causes him terrible problems. And so, for whatever reason, and you wouldn't think that that would be something too horrible. It's just working out yourself what it is that you respond to, and just being curious.
Absolutely. And I think that that's really important what you said there about the bloating, and that that's not a sign of inflammation in itself, just because you've got some pain from having too many beans and not getting used to them. I'm going to take you back to ultra processed foods, and whether they are actually all equal when it comes to autoimmune disease, or whether we can not throw the baby out with the bathwater. Are there some that people with autoimmune disease may not have to put full effort into avoiding?
Well, that's a really important question, Claire. We want to focus mainly on whole foods, but we have to get through life, you know, and it has to be practical. And I think some whole foods that are included on a plant-based diet have been labelled as processed. But are they a problem? I think the things that get the bad press at the minute are plant-based milks, that they're ultra processed, often because they've been fortified, or sometimes it's the coagulants in them. And so my advice for autoimmune disease is they're not all bad. Their fortification can be helpful. If you have a sensitive gut or a leaky gut, then some of the emulsifiers might not be beneficial. So they often, if they use carrageenan, for example, in some experiments, it's been shown to cause some inflammation on the gut lining. However, these experiments were always done in concentrated amounts. But again, some of the chemical emulsifiers are not beneficial for the gut lining, particularly if you've got an autoimmune disease in your gut, like celiac disease or Crohn's disease or something like that. I always say, look at it and look at the product and see how far away it is from the original. And I will always recommend that people use as whole an ingredient as possible. So, for example, I'd never recommend anybody having a plant-based margarine, for example. So no spread. You're getting your fats from nut butters, or things like a little bit of extra virgin olive oil or cold pressed flaxseed oil. So then as minimally refined as possible. With all of these conversations, it's about compared to what, you know. So yeah, as you say, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Just try to look at where your starting point is and see what is a better version of what you might have been eating.
Brilliant. And get as far as with that as you can. And I always think it's such a shame, we're so used to baking with butter, and then when you transition and you think, oh, it's great, I've got this thing that's exactly like butter, and then you realize, oh, it's got all this stuff in it that I actually don't want to be eating. And you've got to kind of think through, as you can tell us all about, think through how to change the way you're cooking so that you're just using more whole food ingredients.
Yeah, yeah.
But I think also food manufacturers are sort of coming onto this, aren't they? Because if you look at plant-based milks nowadays, you can find more and more options without emulsifiers and carrageenan and things like that. And I've noticed even some of the organic brands that were not allowed to be fortified because of the organic label or something like that are now starting to become fortified, and therefore, just literally calcium, vitamin D, and oat and water. So I think the companies are starting to change, aren't they, on that front?
Yeah, and I think that's really good. And again, I would always recommend that people become really good at reading labels. It can mean that you'll take a bit longer in the supermarket, although when you're eating a whole food plant-based diet, you don't visit many of the shelves in the supermarket, so you've got that little bit of extra time. So it's about reading the labels. But yeah, as fewer ingredients as possible on the list is ideal.
But Karen, I mean, I completely agree. But if someone's newly diagnosed with an autoimmune condition, is finding it all a bit overwhelming, what's the best way to just simplify things and start to transition to a plant-based diet?
Yeah, and that is really important because it is overwhelming. That is for sure. So one of the most important things is to do something. Rather, and know that by doing something, then you're making progress. And so my first thing I always say to people is just eat more fruit and vegetables. So few people even get 5 a day. And the research suggests that 10 or 12 portions of fruit and vegetables a day are actually ideal. So, just by increasing that, it's as simple as adding fruit to your breakfast, or having 2 or 3 portions of vegetables with your main meal. Just really simple things. So start there. So start building that up. And then as you build that up, you start increasing your amount of other food. So it could be you add in beans to your favorite meal. Say you like chili, for example, and you're using it with minced meat, but you've already got some beans in there. So start increasing the amount of beans, then reduce the amount of meat. So you don't have to just change overnight. Some people do. Some people are all nothing people. And if you do, then good on you, but just be prepared for some side effects, while your gut adapts to it. But just making these little changes as we go along. Then the next thing, as you're decreasing your meat intake, I definitely recommend swapping from dairy to a dairy-free milk of choice. I always recommend soy milk. Soy milk is high in protein, very similar protein structure to dairy, but very different to dairy. And so it's useful in baking as well. It works the best in baking. So just making those little steps so that you're increasing your plants and you're decreasing your animal intake. And I think the most important thing to remember is this isn't a short-term diet. This is a way of eating that will help support your health for the rest of your life. You're playing the long game. So whatever you do, just keep on moving forward. So if it just is a tiny bit at a time, then that's all really good as well. And like I say, it depends that, if you like burgers, then swap a meat burger for a plant-based burger. Are they the healthiest thing you can eat? The debate is out on that, but it's going to be better than the meat version. Because when you grill meat, for example, you release lots of toxins and hydrocarbons, and you get these advanced glycation products. So there's lots of inflammatory things in there. In the meat, you're getting the heme iron, which if you have too much of that also puts this inflammatory effect on your body. Whereas if you're having a plant-based burger, then you're not going to have those same inflammatory compounds. And then as you get used to your taste change and you learn different ways of cooking, then you might choose to start reducing the amount of those that you're eating and start eating more whole foods.
That's brilliant. Yeah. No, that's really great advice. And Karen, I mean, online there's obviously lots of different people with their nutrition advice, whether they have qualifications or not. But are there any myths, or is there one particular myth on plant-based diets and autoimmune disease that you'd love to debunk today?
There are many.
Okay.
But I think the one that gets me most is this about anti-nutrients,
Yeah.
and particularly things like lectins. So lectins are a thing. You know, they're compounds in plants that protect them. Let's say beans, for example. Let's say red kidney beans, because these are the main one that you hear about. And I remember when I was a teenager, I had a summer job in a healthy cafe, and we had a guy came in, and we did baked potatoes with baked beans, but these were posh baked beans that had kidney beans in them. I think that's what made them healthy. And he was just, are they cooked? Are they cooked properly? And I'm like, well, yeah, it's in a tin. 17-year-old, no idea what he's talking about. And I just thought it was a bit odd. And then, so the problem is that if red kidney beans aren't prepared properly, they are high in these lectins and they can make you sick. But the whole process of preparing, we don't eat them raw, do we? I mean, you can't even eat a red kidney bean raw, surely. So you soak them until they're softened and then you cook them. And that process of soaking and softening removes the lectins and therefore make them perfectly safe to eat, and also release all the healthy nutrients within them, as well as the fiber. And there is research about the dangers of lectins, but these are animal experiments where they've fed them concentrated amounts of raw beans, and it damages their gut lining. So first of all, we're not mice or rats, but secondly, we don't eat concentrated amounts of beans.
No, I think you're right. I mean, of course, we're not eating raw beans. Even from a can, they're cooked, aren't they? And I think, I mean, we did a whole nugget episode on lectins in the early days of starting this podcast. But yes, we were very frustrated with the advice out there that is clearly disinformation and misinformation. But I actually decided to Google autoimmune diets, as I'm sure many of my patients have when they get a diagnosis. And one of the top hits was this, I found this autoimmune protocol, which is some sort of elimination diet centered around paleo diets. I was wondering what your thoughts were on that, because I'm sure many people might come across that when they are Googling things.
Yes, yeah. For a long time, that was the only thing when you looked it up, or you looked into diet for autoimmune disease, that was the only thing that came up. Fortunately, now, if you Google it, it will also talk about the Mediterranean diet because of that recent research. And indeed, when I did my training as a nutritionist, this is what came up in the course as well. And the idea of it is going back to eating like our ancestors did. You eliminate foods that potentially could cause damage to the gut lining. So that includes things like dairy and eggs on the animal product side of things. But then it also includes nuts and seeds, beans, legumes, all of these foods that we know are really healthy and are packed full of fiber, which is good for the microbiome. And the idea of it is the fact that it helps reset your gut health. And so the meat side of it is grass-fed meat or wild meat and organs as well, and then oily fish, a high amount of fruits and vegetables, essentially. And I tried to find the evidence. I've looked in writing the book. I cannot find any large-scale research done on this. There's certainly small research projects with usually less than 100 or maybe like 20 or so people. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence out there as well of people who feel better on it. It doesn't lead you anywhere. You said the key word, elimination diet. It's supposed to be, the theory behind it is it's a short-term way of eating, and then you gradually increase other foods and see how you're feeling. And in the short term, some people, if they are reacting, if their microbiome is disturbed, which we know that will be, by cutting out beans, for example, they might feel more comfortable. But where's the fiber? Is my first question. So it cuts out fiber. It cuts out some of the healthiest foods like nuts and seeds with all those healthy fats. And it includes animal products, which are expensive. Grass-fed meat is really expensive, and so it should be because of the environmental impact. So this is not going to solve the problem. But also, we know that meat, it's got no fiber, it's got these inflammatory compounds in it, and that just makes the problem worse. So, there is no evidence behind it, and people get kind of stuck in it. I just think as a way of eating, for some people, it may help them, and I'm not denying that, because the research does show there is not one single diet that suits everybody, and I'm a realist. However, I believe that for most people, it's something that is unaffordable, it's inaccessible, and you can't continue with it. It's not something that will work in the long term.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think, short term, if it helps, like you say, with some gut symptoms, we don't know what it's doing long term to someone's coronary arteries, their cholesterol levels, to their overall risk of things like diabetes, which we know goes up with animal protein, as does cardiovascular disease. So you're trying to fix one thing, but actually you're creating problems later on, aren't you?
And that's really important that you said that, Daisy, because people with autoimmune disease have a much higher risk of developing chronic health conditions like hypertension and other heart disease. But equally, people who have chronic health conditions, particularly obesity, have an increased risk of developing autoimmune disease.
Right.
So, so they're all connected anyway. And so you could be looking at trying to help you feel better and relieve some of the symptoms, but in the long term, it has different negative effects.
Yeah. And obviously we're trying to put out here some evidence-based information with this podcast, but how can people evaluate nutrition advice, do you think, when there is so much conflicting information available online?
Well, it's tricky, isn't it? Yeah. And I saw something the other day about 80% of the nutrition advice on TikTok is not good advice. It's not evidence-based advice, which is a real worry.
Yeah.
So, so I always go by, is it accessible, affordable, and achievable? They're the three things which are really, really important. But then I look at, well, what is what is the evidence behind this? Is there research? So I know not everybody is like me. They won't go diving off into it. But if someone is making a claim, there should be the evidence behind it. But the other way to tell is, what else are they trying to sell you? Because anything that is restrictive is there's going to be, oh, well, you need to take this supplement and you need to take this supplement. And so there's often a lot of money making behind it. Which I know sounds ironic with someone who, I want someone to buy my book, but so even on a plant-based diet, that you do need to take some supplements. And in my myth busting, one of the bits is you need to take lots of supplements. So you do need to take B12, and you need to check where your iodine's coming from, and you need to take vitamin D. And vitamin D is really important, but for everybody, but particularly for autoimmune disease, because it has a positive impact for your immune system. But apart from that, you should be able to get everything from the food that you eat, as long as you eat a variety of foods and you eat enough food as well.
No, that's brilliant. I think you're excellent at explaining the science, and having read your book, I think you're really good at breaking down quite complex information into manageable chunks. So I've got two questions on that. Firstly, please tell us more about your book and when can people buy it?
Okay, so the book itself is called Healing from the Inside Out, as you said. And it's split into two parts. So the first part is looking at what is autoimmune disease, looking at the microbiome, and then looking at the impact of food on autoimmune disease. So I explore the foods to avoid, the foods to consume, but I also include easy steps to take and other things to consider, like the impact of food on the medication that you're taking, for example, and basically just how to get by. And then the second half is 100 recipes ranging from breakfast and snacks and main meals. And there's definitely cake in there. There's always cake wherever I go that you can start enjoying and start experimenting with. And it's published through Hammersmith Health Books publishers, available online and in your independent bookstores and hopefully some other bookstores as well.
That's brilliant. Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah, I am really excited, and thank you for your review. And I have had some incredible feedback. For example, Dr. Neil Barnard from the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine has given me a lovely review, as has Brenda Davis. And I still can't stop smiling about it because I've been following them, since 15 years. And suddenly I was popping emails with them. That's really exciting. So I am really, really pleased. And the whole purpose of it is really to help people with an autoimmune disease, just to take back that control. Because when I got my diagnosis, I mentioned that I was really devastated. But through my nursing, I'd spent a lot of time talking to patients, and I really got to understand how difficult it is to live with a chronic health condition and the negative impact it has on your life, and how much people were disempowered and they passed their power, if you like, over to the medical profession. Nothing against the medical profession, love them, in an acute situation, that's what you need to do. But in the long term, you're the one that lives with this. And I'd already thought, even before I got my diagnosis, that if I ever become a patient, I'm not going to give my power away. Some doctors don't like that because then you become the difficult patient. But it's much more being really involved with it and just knowing that you are doing everything that you can. And that is what I want the book to be about. I want people to understand what is going on in their bodies and what they can do to empower themselves to be as well as they can whilst living with an autoimmune disease.
Yeah, totally. Well, you do a great job achieving that, Karen. Very big congratulations. It's excellent. And we'll put the links in the show notes for sure. And like you say, 100 recipes, which is great enough to get anyone started, that's for sure. But can we ask you what you're having for dinner tonight? Will it be one of those recipes in your book?
What am I having for dinner tonight? We're actually going away tomorrow. So it's going to be a bit of a use-up meal. So we've got quite a lot of veggies left in the fridge and some smoked tofu to use up. So I'm going to be there's a recipe for a stir-fried tamarind sauce, which is really lovely. It's that real kind of sweet and sour. So it's got some dates in it and tamarind, obviously, but also a little bit of cumin and, just so it's got some really lovely flavours. So I'll be doing a stir-fry, use that stir-fry with the smoked tofu and then the stir-fried tamarind sauce. And then I've also got, for dessert, a caramel and apple slice. And I've got some of that left over. So I shall need to finish that up, obviously.
Sounds brilliant. I love that sort of use up meal because you feel like, less food waste. You're getting all those vegetables that are idling in the fridge to some use.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
I love a stir fry. How about you, Claire? What are you doing?
Tonight, I'm going to have a quick tea. So I'm going to make one of my tofu omelettes. And I've got some lovely woodland mushrooms to put in the middle of it. I probably talked to you about this omelette before, haven't I? I was saying, no,
I don't think you have.
Have I
Maybe
not?
not on the podcast, I don't think.
No, okay. Well, there are loads of recipes for omelettes, and a lot of people just make one with gram flour, so the chickpea flour. But I I do put a bit of chickpea flour in there, but mostly it's just silken tofu and then some things to bind it. So I do use a little bit of ground up flaxseed and some tapioca flour. And the other thing would then be the gram flour and some seasoning and a little bit of turmeric for the colour. And it takes, I have to admit, you know, from my experience of cooking egg omelettes in the past, it does take longer. You have to be patient, kind of get the temperature down and leave it sitting in the pan. Otherwise, you'll end up with a kind of scrambled egg type mess. But if you're patient, the whole thing goes pretty solid, and then you just flip it closed, and you've got that exciting pocket of, you know, a tofu pocket with the mushrooms in the middle. Really nice.
Sounds good, Claire. I think we'll get some requests for that recipe. If you want to send it to me, I'll put it in the show notes.
If you like.
I can imagine we'll get some interest in that one. That sounds quite unusual. Sounds good.
What about you, Daisy? Are you what are you having on your Friday night?
I've actually got one of those use up everything you've got in the fridge type recipes, actually, because I got a new cookbook for Christmas. I got Soph's Plant Kitchen, which I was very pleased about. I was looking at that earlier today thinking, what can I cook from this new book with the limited amount of food I've got in my fridge at the moment? But I've got mushrooms and I've got carrots and I've got a tin of lentils somewhere and some leftover pasta. So I'm going to try her version of bolognese, like a lentil ragu. It looks really good, actually, and she just put mushrooms and it's all that umami flavour. And I don't know what makes it high protein, because it's a high protein cookbook. I guess it's the combination of lentils and maybe some silken tofu. I can't remember, but it's going to be good. Well, on that note, Karen, thank you so much for coming on today. It's been really excellent. As I say, you've broken down these really complicated autoimmune science into really digestible format for us to understand, and I hope that listeners have found that useful as much as we have. So thank you again.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Karen.